So hello everyone, welcome back, and thanks again for being with us on day 4 of the Asia Markets Forum. Our last presenter today is Dennis Mezrel, who's coming to us live. But before I pass it over to Dennis, if you'll allow me, I just have a little brief bio that I'd like to read. And first of all, thanks so much for sharing your evening with us, Dennis. As a co-founder, executive director of Tractus, I'm sure you're a very occupied businessman. And so with that, Mr. Mezrel, you are a founding partner and executive director of Tractus Asia. And Dennis has led the firm in advising on more than $5 billion in trade and investment transactions across a wide variety of sectors. And I presume that's 5 billion US dollars. So in over 25 years of living and working in Asia, Dennis has gained a strategic and operational experience running service and manufacturing organizations. So he brings this practical experience to us today, and to his current role in assisting many companies, again, in a variety of manufacturing and services sectors from North America, from Europe, from Asia, helping them to make informed decisions about where to locate their investments and how to structure and operate them for growth and profitability. So this experience, Dennis, you also bring to government agencies such as OMB and such as those that are represented by several of my colleagues on the line today, who help SMEs with their exporting and their foreign investment decisions on a day-to-day basis. So thanks again, Dennis, for joining us. We certainly do look forward to your advice, to your knowledge, and in advance for sharing your practical experiences so that we can help to grow our SMEs, and so that we can help our SMEs to sell more of their goods and services in Vietnam especially. Over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for the introduction. And I'm going to share my screen here.
And while you're doing that, Dennis, I'll just remind folks that we do have time with you for a Q&A, and you're going to stay on the line with us 20, 25 minutes. And so to all of our attendees, to use the chat to type in your questions, and we'll moderate that after.
Got to get rid of you guys. Yes, and Suzanne, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody in Canada, and bonjour. You'll see here that John Evans was supposed to be the presenter. He's one of my other co-founding partners. We left the name here on the presentation, but now you know who I am. Wanted to give you a little bit of, you've got a little bit of background on Tractus Asia. This is just something visual so that you can see we've got offices across the developing markets. We've been here, needs to be updated. We've been here 25 years. We celebrated our 25th anniversary in December. And we've worked on, as Suzanne was saying, about $8 billion worth of different kinds of investment and trade. You know, a lot of that composed of large companies, but we also work with governments in Canada and North America and the United States, helping, I'm on 2 lines here. Just, can you confirm you can hear me okay?
Great.
Yes, you can. Okay. So we've worked with governments, states in the United States and provinces in Canada, as Suzanne was saying, and with the SMEs or new to market or medium-sized firms, helping them to grow their business throughout Asia across a wide variety of different sectors. We've worked in things from the automotive industry through to zeolites. So any of those of you that are in industrial minerals will know what zeolites are, and pretty much everything in between. But today, this is a hard act to follow because the trade counselors did such a great job of talking about the market opportunities in Vietnam in particular. So I'm just going to touch on a few things about the Vietnam, the market opportunities here in the beginning. But then I want to dive in and spend much more time on the actual market entry strategies. So what you need to do in order to effectively enter the markets, sell your products, potentially even invest there, depending on the kind of people that are on the call today. But in general, we're always very bullish on ASEAN. It's a fascinating sort of regional market in and of itself. Vietnam is fascinating, but the entire market really, when you take a step back, there's actually no other more diverse geographic region in the world than ASEAN. So you've got these 10 countries, with over 600 million, 650 million people. Some of the countries are enormous, like Indonesia with 250 million. Vietnam is large at 95, but you've got Singapore at 6. And then you've got countries with per capita GNP or purchasing power. Number one is Singapore at almost 48,000 US dollars per capita. And you've got some relatively poor ones, such as Cambodia and Myanmar, that are in the 1,000 US dollars a month, a year per capita income. But there's everything in between, and there's every level of development and different types of development, from highly agriculturally focused countries, Vietnam happens to be one of those, to highly high-tech oriented ones like Singapore. So as you're looking for opportunities, if Vietnam doesn't fit the bill necessarily, as you've seen throughout this week, there's lots of other opportunities, across ASEAN, depending on what your service is and depending on what your products are. But today's all about Vietnam, so we want to focus on that. There's been some questions about COVID. I was in Vietnam. I'm based in Bangkok, Thailand, by the way. This is where we started the company, and it's our operational headquarters here. Although we've got offices around the region, one in Vietnam. And I was there in November and December working on a project with a client of ours. Had to go through quarantine, so I had to spend 15 days in a hotel before they would let me out. And the reason they do that is Vietnam has done quite a good job of the lockdown in Vietnam to help control COVID is locking down the country. So Vietnam itself is pretty much an island. You can't get into it unless you have special permission. So you normally need a visa to go to various countries. So you need that, but you also need special permission from the Center for Disease Control there, immigration and the police. And then when you do get there, you actually have to go into what's called alternative state quarantine. You have to go to a hotel that you pay for by yourself, and you stay there for 15 days. You get tested for COVID twice, and if you're negative both times, at the end of that quarantine period, you're released. And then you're pretty much, things are normal. And the economy reminds me of what it was like pre-COVID, except people are wearing their masks much more often. Mask wearing in Vietnam was really common beforehand, before the pandemic, when people were on their motorbikes. That's the main form of transportation. But everyone wears masks, and they've done an exceptional job, as you can see from this graph. This is some statistics from just January. There's been a few outbreaks here and there, but they do a very good job of controlling them. And that's allowed the economy to actually remain. In 2020, I think they were about 1.5% or 1% economic growth, which is booming compared to the rest of the world. Places like the US, which was negative 4%, and the UK they're forecasting minus 12 this past year. So despite COVID, the economy has been relatively robust compared to everyone else. Just to give you an idea in terms of the sectors, you can see, maybe starting at the bottom, in terms of industries, Vietnam is still a highly agriculturally focused economy, and that's growing at 2% a year, which for the agricultural industry, that's quite rapid. And you may think, well, what kind of export opportunities does that present for Canada? And you saw from the trade commissioners, there are some niche opportunities on the actual agricultural product side and food product side. But when you think of agriculture, you need to also think about agro industry, and it's a very broad sector. And so there's usually, but what we've seen in Vietnam and in other markets in ASEAN, is there's always these niche sectors. So agriculture includes rice, rubber, and aquaculture, which is things like fish farming and shrimp farming. And there's a lot of industries in Canada that have special products that may be able to support growth in these industries going forward. We've worked with companies, not Canadian, but other ones that have these niche products that they can sell into the agricultural sector, because it's doing very well. Obviously, there's industry that's growing tremendously, that's fueled by foreign direct investment. So foreign companies investing in Vietnam to manufacture products for export. And a lot of that is based on the strategy of China plus one. So there's lots of companies that are in China. They've suffered in some cases by rising costs. So China, for some products, is not the lowest cost place to manufacture. Sorry about that. And or because a lot of companies were exporting to the United States, and with the tariff increases that we've seen over the last couple of years, they needed another place to locate their investment for their US bound exports. And Vietnam is high on the list of attractive places to invest for manufacturing for export. So the manufacturing industry is growing rapidly because it's driven by this foreign direct investment. It's driven by domestic investment and exports. And again, where there's exports, there's demand for raw materials, intermediate materials, subcomponents, and services that these exporters need to fulfill their export demand. The Vietnamese, although you can see manufacturing is a large part of the economy, it's not very deep. So there's not a lot of supporting industries. And what products, supporting industry products that can't be manufactured in Vietnam tend to be imported. And then on the top, you see services, and a lot of that driven by retail, driven by increasing consumer spending. So as the economy has grown over the last decade sharply, so has the incomes of Vietnamese. Their purchasing power has gone up, and they're spending money on retail products and such. So there's opportunities all across the retail sector, again, depending on what your product or service may look like. We've been in Vietnam since 2007, and it's always been an exciting market for us. It's always, almost throughout that entire 13, 14-year period, it's been the fastest growing market in ASEAN for us, or tied with some of the other ones. And it's continued to expand when some of the other markets, more traditional markets in ASEAN, Thailand, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia have stagnated a little bit. They're not growing nearly as fast. And this growth we're seeing driving consumer spending and opportunities for ready-to-eat food. As you can see, food consumption is growing up by 15% annually in terms of its percentage of GDP. Not surprising given Vietnam's current level of development. And so that's opportunities for niche food products, both fresh and packaged, and/or products that go into the food products that are manufactured in Vietnam already. For example, Vietnam's a pretty big dairy producer in and of itself. They don't do a lot of export, but there's demand for dairy cattle genetics and things like that, and services and equipment and such that can be used in dairy farming to make it more productive. Those are the types of opportunities that we always see in these developing markets. People look at maybe per capita GNP and say, oh my gosh, the purchasing power parity, or the purchasing power of these particular countries is quite low. How am I possibly going to sell my product? But you really need to do your research, look very carefully at what the sectors there are. And this is a good example. Look at what's being exported, because if it's being exported, it means it's being manufactured. Now, if it's being manufactured, depending on the kind of product it is, so coffee and those types of things made from agricultural products, there's maybe nothing you can directly provide, but coffee, and Vietnam is one of the largest coffee producers in the world. They're not only exporting beans, but they're roasting them. They're producing some final products. There could be some niche services and/or equipment that you can sell into the market for those sectors. Another big market is footwear, so athletic footwear and other types of footwear, growing tremendously as some of these manufacturers move out of higher cost countries, places like China. They're looking for other places to locate. We're working with one major manufacturer, a couple major manufacturers, helping them one company actually set up their first manufacturing in Vietnam because they were manufacturing the subcomponents that are used in athletic shoes. They weren't available locally. Another company that we've worked with is a smaller one, and they've used one of the strategies I'm going to talk about to enter the market. So they've been exporting and selling, and their salespeople have been kind of flying in, and they want to put somebody on the ground, and they want to do that cost effectively without setting up a company. And I'll talk to you about how you can possibly do that. They're selling adhesives and special kinds of chemical products that go into the footwear market. So in order to make the shoes, none of the highly niche chemicals and specialty chemicals and coatings that are used in the footwear that's made in Vietnam are actually made in Vietnam. It's all imported. So even lots of opportunities for exports from Canada, even looking at the industries that are exporting from Vietnam. And then on the import side, that's more direct. So if you're doing your research, and the trade commissioners talked about some of the different opportunities, but you can see what the opportunities are here in terms of what's being imported into Vietnam. And just because there's some small numbers on some of these sectors or these products doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a market for your product or your service, because it may be better positioned than your competitors. So doing your research is important. Working with the trade commissioners is a great way to find out what you need to find out. And these were some other sectors and such where showing the types of things that are being exported directly from Canada. But we heard quite a lot about the opportunities for these products from the trade commissioner. So I won't spend a lot of time on this slide or this slide. I think it's better to jump into understanding what your market entry options are for Vietnam, what's out there, and kind of the most important issue that you need to think about is, are you ready? And you need to do your research to find out what are the market segments, and what are the market niches. In many cases, you have to do quite a bit of hard work to see if there's opportunities for your product. Now, Vietnam is, as I said, a very fast-growing market, but I heard a couple times, I was glad to hear it, that it's a developing economy. It's a command economy, so it's a socialist economy, and so the government likes to guide it. There's quite a number of regulations. It's a highly regulated market. It's relatively open in terms of the sectors and the things that you can do there and export there, but it's cumbersome is probably the best word, and you need to be aware of that as you determine the market opportunity. And then after you determine there's a market opportunity, you need to see if there's a business case for your product, right? You need to look at whatever your pricing structure, your positioning, your competitors. Can you effectively export to the market or enter that market? And if so, what's the strategy for doing so? And one of the advantages that I know we work with a lot with, just because of our backgrounds, we work a lot with U.S. companies, and the U.S. really missed the boat, no pun intended here with the picture, in not joining the TPP 4 years ago. And Canada has a great opportunity to leverage its participation in now the TPP, which as you can see, there are a lot of products, and the commissioners talked about it, that are currently duty-free. And there's some other ones where the Vietnamese government has taken the option of slowly removing tariffs over time. So there's things like beef and pork are not yet fully tariff-free, but they will be. But there are a lot of opportunities for getting into the market. Now, the commissioners also talked about, because it's regulated, you need to be aware of, as in developing your strategy and in doing your research, the types of product licensing that you're going to need to do. So you need product licenses in Vietnam, and then you need import licenses, which if you're doing it yourself, you would get these licenses. You have to have a local legal entity, some local legal entity to apply for these licenses for you and hold them. And we'll talk about some of the strategies for doing that. Using a distributor or agent is one of them, and how you find them and how you leverage them is going to be important. So once you've done your research, Once you determine that there's a market opportunity, that there's a business case for your product or service, you check the regulations to make sure that your product or service can comply. So if you have, we've worked with companies in medical devices and medical supplies, highly regulated in almost every market, and you'll find the same in Vietnam. So you'll need not only product licenses and import licenses, but certificates of free sale, showing that you have registration in your home market and you're able to sell in your home market, plus other types of standards that might be required, again, depending on your kind of product. So once you've done all your homework, once you've decided that you've got a product, although it's regulated, you have the right certifications and such to be able to sell something in Vietnam, then you need to decide what your strategy is. And there's really four main strategies that we talk about when we talk to companies about selling into any market or selling cross-border. There's direct sales, and there was a question about e-commerce. So that certainly is an option, and that's maybe the best way to put your toe in the water and test the market. There's looking for channel partners. So that could be distributors or agents, and that's by far the typical way of looking at it. And then there's an in-country presence. And most people think about an in-country presence as setting up a company locally, but there's a kind of a halfway to do that, and you can outsource. So you can rely on outsourcing companies, and I'll explain that in a little bit, to be able to be an employer of record for your employee. If you have employees in Canada that you want to send, an expatriate, or if you want to employ Vietnamese locals, Vietnamese nationals locally. And of course, if you really want to go all in, you can set up a local company. So I don't have too many slides on these. I'll just leave this up. But e-commerce is booming. I'll talk about e-commerce first, and that's booming in Vietnam. It's booming in Southeast Asia like it is in North America, but it looks a little bit different. So the e-commerce market in Vietnam last year was worth about $14 billion. So seems small in comparison to North America, but it's been growing at about 20% a year, so high growth. And if you want to enter, if you want to access the market through e-commerce, it's actually the best way to do that is through the local e-commerce platform. So everybody in North America and Canada is familiar with Amazon. That's probably the best way to get into the Canadian market or the North American market, but not in Southeast Asia and not in Vietnam. And there's four other companies that have platforms. One is called Shopee. These you've probably never heard of, but they're enormous companies. They're very successful, and they're the platforms that you want to be on. One's called Shopee. There's another one called Lazada, and then there's two other local ones called Tiki and another one with a very strange Vietnamese name. But those are the top four, and they provide the payment mechanisms. They provide the actual transaction platform, and they provide, in some of them, provide some value-added services for warehousing and fulfillment, such that you can keep products locally, and because of the distance, you can keep products locally and ship them to your customers to meet their expectations. And so one is a way to test the waters, but you still need a product because of the distance. You need a high value to weight ratio product because it'll end up being shipped air freight. And some of the kinds of products that are really commonly purchased online in Vietnam right now, electronics, kind of the typical e-commerce products: electronics, fashion and beauty, food and personal care, furniture and appliances wouldn't be something that the companies that are on the line would be involved in, toys, do-it-yourself, and hobbies. There's just in terms of getting an idea of what this is like, there's 68 million internet users out of the 95 million people that are in Vietnam, and 55 million of them, so almost 90% of all the internet people with internet access, purchased something online in 2019, and the average purchase was $54, which isn't bad considering the average per capita income in Vietnam. So best way to enter the market from the e-commerce side is through these local players. Now, to do that, there's still some investment that you need to make. So the best way to succeed in e-commerce in any cross-border market is localization. So if you're selling a product that's suitable for e-commerce, you probably also have your own corporate website. That really needs to be localized into the Vietnamese language, so that companies that are looking, when they look at your online presence through an e-commerce platform, and they want to look at your products, or they want to look at who you are as a company, they can access that information in Vietnamese. You may want to, if you're using social media to do your marketing, you would want to localize that, not necessarily on, and you'd want to localize that on the platforms that are used in Vietnam. So Facebook happens to be one of the ones that's big in Vietnam. If you have digital content that goes along with your products, brochures and those types of things, they should be localized. And in some cases, you might find it cost effective to localize some of the packaging with specialized, or you may need to, because of the regulatory requirements with specialized labeling. And the statistics are really clear across the globe. Companies that are selling through an e-commerce platform and channel, they're much more effective when they do some form of localization. We've got some statistics and information on that we can share with you if you'd like. The most common way to enter a market is through agents or distributors. That was talked about kind of extensively with the trade commissioners. And typically an agent or distributor is relied on heavily by an exporter or a manufacturer to do the importing, customs clearance, warehousing and inventory, marketing, sales fulfillment. If it's a technical product, it may require preventive maintenance. It may require calibration. It may be something that you would have to repair and or do some type of technical support and training for the customer. And as I mentioned, usually companies are relying on an agent or distributor to do product licensing or import licensing, and even trademark registration. So if you have a trademark, if you have a brand or you have a trademark that you want to trademark in Vietnam, that'll need to be done all locally. What you need to be careful about, and why it's critical to find the right partner, is in a place like Vietnam, and in Vietnam, the regulations are such that you need a local legal entity to apply for these product and import licenses and or a trademark. You have to be careful. If you let your distributor do that, they then become the product license, the import license, and the trademark license owner. So if they don't turn out to be the best distributor for you and you need to separate, you may lose control of your product registrations and your product licensing. So it's really critical to find the best partner. I mean, to us, it's critical to find the best partner in any market because of the time and effort it takes to work with them and get them up to speed and get them to know your product or service. But it's even more critical in Vietnam because of some of these issues with product licensing and import licensing and then trademark registration. So to us, it's all about process. Finding the right agent, finding the right distributor takes research, but it takes a good process. And the process that we use is we use when we're helping companies, but you can also do this yourself. You can manage the process yourself. Is very systematic. So we suggest that you sit down and you try to define some factors that are critical in a good distributor. So what factors you need such that if that company doesn't meet those criteria or those factors, you shouldn't be considering them at all. And so some things like that could be, do they have a nationwide distribution network? So is your market nationwide? Do you need somebody that when you start on the ground, they have a nationwide network? Are they representing any products from your competitors so you wouldn't want them to be representing yours or your service? Are they representing products that are complementary to you that would be helpful, because sometimes your product is sold as a package sometimes technical products are sold that way. Or if they're selling complementary products, they'll have a much better understanding of your product and service and the market. And so it'll just be easier for them to get up to speed. The learning curve will be much, much less. And then, of course, a critical factor for us is, do they have an interest in working with you? Are they really passionate about the kind of products that you're selling or the services that you're selling? So that's a first screen. So you need to make sure that your distributor or agent really has this, it really meets these critical factors before you want to continue. And that may require vetting or screening or eliminating dozens of companies, depending on your market and depending on the kind of product or service that you're selling. After you do that, what we like to call is what's left are companies that meet all your critical factors are a long list, a qualified long list. And so maybe there's 5 or 10 companies left. Well, you can't be negotiating or trying to work with 10 different companies to figure out if they're the best one for you. We then suggest you define some other factors that are important to selecting the distributor, but that aren't critical to their success. And they could range from a lot of just a wide range, but they're not critical. Identify these important factors. Kind of think to yourself what 5 or 6 key attributes are necessary for you to be successful. Maybe the attributes that you found successful in distributors that you've brought on board in other markets. And then once you've identified those factors, then kind of put a weight on them. Which ones are more important? If you have 5 or 6, are they equally important? If there's 5 factors, are they equally sort of 20% of the decision of which one to choose is based on a given factor, or certain of the important factors more important than the other? And then continue to do your research and due diligence. Getting information about the particular company, their financial wherewithal, the character references and other reference of the vendors, references from the businesses that they're working with, other principals that they may be working with. If they're also distributing complementary products, how long they've been in the business. These are the kind of things that the trade commissioner can help with. The trade commissioners from Canada can help with. You can also do your own homework, and you can find other resources on the ground if you're still having difficulty. But once you've got those criteria, once you've done your research and rated each of the distributors against those criteria, then you can see, you add up the scores and you can see which one scores the highest, which 1 or 2 companies score the highest. And those are the ones then you can spend the time and effort to start developing a relationship with. Maybe you want to appoint 2 companies to be a distributor in different regions of the country or for different product mixes if you have different product types, just to gauge who might be the most successful, and give them a year and see how it works out. And then choose one over the other. Let them know that. Divide them by region, regionally. Maybe you want somebody in the north and the south to see how that goes. But it's just critical that you spend a lot of time up front looking at what the potential options are, because of how critical it is. You're a long distance away. It's a very challenging market and can be cumbersome in many ways. There is still lots of opportunities, but you need to put the time and the effort to make sure you get the right partner. If you've already got a distributor in the market, maybe things are going all right, and your business is growing. Maybe you have but you need a little more technical support, or that distributor or distributor network that you have, or customer network you have if you've been successful selling directly. And you want to put somebody on the ground. I alluded to one way you can without setting up a company is to use outsourcing services. So there's companies, HR companies can do this, or corporate secretarial firms can do this. And what they can do is they can be an employer of record for your staff member. And this could be an expatriate. It could be somebody from Canada, or it could be a local person who they can employ. And then you can also work with other kind of outsourcing firms, serviced offices if you need some office space for that individual, accounting services and such for managing expenses and those types of things. And the trade commissioners and other resources, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, can provide you with sources of these kinds of companies that can provide this outsourcing service. it also happens to be something that Tractus does. We call it our business incubator, where we work with companies and we provide all those services ourselves in kind of one place. Plus, we can provide some management support and oversight to help that local staff person on the ground and to help you manage that person that you may have on the ground, because you are 10,000 miles away, and being out of sight and out of mind is not the best way to provide oversight over an individual that's on the ground. So we've done that effectively in many of the markets in Southeast Asia, this kind of halfway point between using distributors effectively and or exporting directly effectively, but before you may want to consider putting an investment on the ground. It's low cost, it's low risk. It's to get somebody on the ground where you can, that's an employee that can control, where you can control them much better than a distributor, for example, is much faster than trying to set up your own organization. It's scalable. You can add 1 or 2 people even before you make a decision about investing. And it's flexible. If that doesn't work out, if the market doesn't work out, it doesn't make sense to have those resources on the ground. It's also very flexible because you can cancel these outsourcing relationships usually on a very short-term basis, and then separate the individuals that you were working with, and you're out of the market. Whereas if you make a foreign direct investment, if you set up a local company in Vietnam, it's not that difficult. It doesn't take that long period of time, and I'll describe that in a minute. But trying to unwind the company in any market is about 10 times more complicated, and it takes quite a lot of time and expense to do it right because of the tax considerations and legal considerations. Much easier to set up than it is to actually shut down. So it's important to look at other alternatives, and outsourcing is a very, very viable one. But if you are big enough, large enough, you've got the capital, it does make sense to invest in a place like Vietnam, you can do that. Most of the sectors are open to foreign companies being able to do business there, and I'll explain that in a minute. And the legal entities that you could possibly choose from are pretty familiar to most companies. So you can set up a branch office, so that's a branch of your Canadian company. That's not usually a widely chosen strategy or structure, only because it presents typically presents some negative tax consequences. There may be some negative tax consequences. There's a representative office, so you can have a legal entity on the ground where you have your own employees and you have your own office. But the only thing that a representative office doesn't allow you to do is invoicing. So you can't invoice locally in local currency. You still have to invoice from your parent company in Canada. But in some cases, that makes more sense when you don't need to, or you don't want to, your sales aren't high enough, or you want to run your sales through your distributor or agent network, and you really just need a representative office to provide technical support and oversight, but you don't want to use an outsourcing arrangement. And then the third way is to form, in Vietnam, what's called a limited liability company, a limited liability corporation, or incorporate a company, and you can do that. You can be 100% wholly Canadian-owned company in Vietnam in just about every sector. There's only 6 sectors that are off limits completely, and they're things like drugs and narcotics, hazardous chemicals, and then some really niche, unusual business sectors that I won't bother going into because they're so unusual. It only takes about 1 to 3 months to set up a company. It's a pretty cumbersome process because of the paperwork and such. You need to be approved to set up. Your investment application needs to be vetted by the local government to see whether it's appropriate. Do they really want you there? So you have to be approved to invest. It's not just filling out the paperwork like typically you would do in Canada or North America. You actually have to be vetted and approved. They need to want you there. So that's cumbersome in that respect. The capital requirements aren't very high. Typical small company startups are about $10,000 US. And then the product registrations and the import licensing, if you want to handle them, and that's one of the reasons to have your own representative office, is you could then, because you have a legal entity, you can do your product registrations, your import registrations, your trademark registrations, and hold those licenses. and not have to worry about it. On a side note, if you work with the agents and distributors, I'm sure one of the questions is going to be, well, how do I protect myself on the product registration and import licensing and trademark registration aspect if I need a local entity? Well, there are reliable service firms who can hold those licenses for you. Law firms can do that. There's some accounting firms that do that. We've done that for some companies, for some of our clients. So if you find a reliable service partner that's not in the business and is not related to your distributor agent, that's one good way to protect yourself when you do find a distributor agent. There are some restricted sectors. They're not very onerous. They're quite unusual. They're restricted, meaning you need to be approved. So you can apply for these, but for the most part, it's highly unlikely that you'll get involved in them. And just to give you some examples, I'm looking at the list here: courier services, advertising, education, electronic games, mining, maritime transport, aircraft, and airlines and those types of things, telecommunications, those typical market segments that are highly restricted, even in places like Canada or other developed markets. Then there's a broader range of industries and industry segments that are conditional, meaning you need to apply or you need to meet certain requirements in order to make those investments. Things like major investments over $220 million US in capital, airports and seaports, mining, oil extraction, cigarette manufacturing, things like economic development zones. The government will look at your application for the investment or look at your application to set up a company, and they may decide that the particular sector that you're in may have a foreign shareholding requirement. It may have an employment requirement. It may have a capital requirement in order for you to register the company. Now, my understanding is, sorry about this, people. My understanding is that most of the companies on the call on the event tonight are small or medium-sized firms, and you're unlikely to be making an investment. But in case you're interested, in case you're at that point in your development curve, those are some of the things that you can get support. You can get support from through the trade commissioners or the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. They can provide you with references and different service providers that could help you get your company set up. And as we said, Vietnam and in the beginning of the first presentation, different than Canada. And this gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the cultural differences. There were some questions about what are the cultural differences between the North and the South. This is kind of a fascinating one. This organization looks at the cultural differences between different countries. And you can see things like power differences. There's more deference in Vietnam. These power difference between older and younger people, or between bosses and their supervisors, and their employees. There's a much more it's a much more hierarchical cultural country than it is in Canada, because it's very strongly based on Confucianism, and like this type of power distance difference that you see in Vietnam is pretty common across Asia. Same thing on the converse is individualism. The Vietnamese are more concerned about social cohesion and less about individual needs and aspirations and such, more concerned about their family. The uncertainty avoidance is a large part concern about making a mistake. So if things are uncertain, means you don't know what the outcome is going to be like, and therefore you may make a mistake. And if you make a mistake, you'll lose face. I think a lot of you may have heard of that concept, or you may be embarrassed. And the Vietnamese, like most of the rest of Southeast Asia, want to avoid embarrassment as much as they can. And it looks like the uncertainty avoidance between Vietnamese and Canadians is closer than it is in some other cultures that we've looked at. And then you can see the long-term orientation, quite a big difference between Canadians and Vietnamese. And one of the things there is if you look, evidence of that is if you look at the savings rate in Vietnam is extraordinarily high, like it is in quite a number of other Asian economies. The Vietnamese save a lot for the future, for their families, their children's education, retirement even. And so they're doing those things. So it just gives you a snapshot of that, and gives you some flavor of some of the things, the differences between Canada and Vietnam. So as you're thinking about entering the market in one way, shape, or form, we've all, over the last, say, 2 hours, we've all talked about the need to do your research to see whether you're ready. I mean, part of that research is looking internally. You know, do you have the capital and the finances to invest in the research that needs to be done, the localization of products or services, whether you're e-commerce or not. And the way you can do that is the best thing is to have somebody local in the market to help you with. There's lots of nuances. It can be a difficult market to get an understanding of what the opportunities are. That's what the trade commissioners are there to help for. There's information, there's webinars that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam holds from time to time. And even if you're not based in Vietnam, you can become associate members of chambers, and we highly recommend that if you're seriously considering entering a market. It's a great way to meet other Canadian companies that are already doing business that can be resources for you, and or to meet service providers that might be able to support you in your market analysis, your market entry, product registrations, and those types of things. And then you need to think about what your strategy is. Where are you in your business development timeline and maturity in Southeast Asia? If you've been in a lot of the markets already and you already have a lot of experience in the rest of Southeast Asian markets, you've got distributors set up on the ground, and that's very effective for you. And you really know what you really know the kind of company you're looking for as a distributor, you can jump right into it. If you're not sure whether your product is going to make sense for the market, and it happens to be a consumer product or something that you can sell through e-commerce, that's a good way to give it a try. Or if you're already active, maybe have some people have an office on the ground somewhere in Southeast Asia. Maybe you're in Singapore and you feel like you really need to have somebody on the ground that you can consider as your employee. You might want to consider an outsourcing relationship first, so that you don't have to go to the expense and effort and difficulty of setting up a company that until you've evaluated and actually confirmed whether that makes the most sense or not. And then if you're ready to go all in, of course, there's actually making the investment and setting up a legal entity in Vietnam. So as we said, we're really bullish on ASEAN. We're bullish on Vietnam. It's a great, exciting market to be in because it's growing so rapidly. I always like going there and spending time in the north and in the south. Very different places to do business. But taking a step back and looking at ASEAN, and that really should be your first step. And that's what this week is all about, helping you to see which markets you might want to prioritize over others. So that you can focus your research on one versus the other and see which is the most high priority. And then you can drill down and decide what your strategy is and how you should actually take advantage of those opportunities. So with that, I hope that was helpful. I guess now's the time to open the floor to some questions.
Thank you, Dennis. Yes, I think that was
You're welcome.
Exceptionally helpful.
Take a glass of water.
Yeah, absolutely. Very detailed. There are, just looking at the time here, I do want to address just a few questions that have come up. So if we could ask
now,
just to indulge
and
us.
Suzanne, Suzanne, just one other thing. A lot of the narrative came from actually a webinar that I did last week for the Canadian ASEAN Business Council of the CABC, and so we have a presentation for that. So we can share that with your companies as well.
That would be very helpful. Thank you. We were aware of the webinar. I think it was last Thursday evening.
Yes.
So there's one question here, and if you could just touch on very quickly, what are some of the key costs of doing business in Vietnam?
Oh, well, I'll have to toss that back as a question. It depends on what kind of business you're planning on doing. I mean, If you're planning on investment in setting up a company, there's certain costs there. If you're planning on, and I talked a little bit about what the capital requirements of setting up a company are, but there's also the operating costs as well. But versus if you're going to find an agent or, a distributor, or if you're going to use an e-commerce platform as an example. So could you give me an understanding of how you're thinking, or what would the strategy be to
Sure.
to enter the market?
Let's look at the cost of hiring the right partner, the right agent, the right distributor. What would we be looking at? Are we looking at an annual salary? Are we looking at a retainer?
Oh, I see. Okay, very good.
Fee? Yeah.
Yeah, typically, like in most markets, when you have an agent or distributor relationship, there's no cost for that. You're not. This would be usually an agent or distributor has their own company, and it doesn't cost you anything to other than the time and effort to do the research, to do the legal the due diligence, and then to set up a distributor agreement, the legal costs of doing that. But then it's up to the agent to then take it from there, or the distributor to take it from there. And usually in your distribution agreement, you'll have, if it's a product, that may be the easiest way to look at it. You'll have some minimum requirements for inventory that they'll need to take, and or sales that they'll need to make. And usually with a distributor, you're just selling to them, and then at a wholesale price, for example, and then they'll mark it up and sell it locally, depending on what their costs of distribution are. And so it really doesn't cost you anything from the point of you exporting the product to Vietnam. And again, that's all up to what your agreement might be like. Are you exporting it on a CIF basis? Are you exporting it on an FOB basis? So the distributor actually has to pay the shipping. Those are the nuts and bolts that you would work out in the distribution agreement.
Okay. And with the typical SME from North America that you've been advising, required to invest in localized brand building, localized sales promotion activities, or can this be, generally speaking, the role at the expense of that local partner?
Agreed. Yes, it can be. It kind of depends on your wherewithal and how much control you want to have. So if you're a smaller company, those would be all of those things you would want to have your distributor take care of and be responsible for. And of course, they may come back and they say, well, if that impacts our costs, and so depending on what your FOB or the CIF price is, that'll impact the discussions you have in terms of a transfer price, the price that you're going to sell your product to them. In some cases, they'll come back and say, well, in terms of marketing or advertising costs, typically they may ask to split that, or they may ask you to contribute, and that contribution could be in terms of cash, but typically you could negotiate a contribution in kind. So marketing materials and things, maybe you'll pay for the localization of what you already have. The marketing materials, you already have the materials, you'll pay for the localization of them. But again, that's a commercial decision. If you'd rather not, you don't have to. A lot of the times you can just push all of that onto the distributor. There will be the cost of, and as I mentioned, we'd highly recommend that you hire some type of service agency, a law firm, and maybe it's a law firm that you'd be using for your distributor or agency agreement to hold your product registrations and your import licensing and your trademark registrations. Or it could be other types of corporate secretarial firms, consulting firms. Again, like I said, those are the kind of things we do. So provided that you've checked their references and they're a reputable firm, and you can find out you can get references from the Trade Commissioner and or the Canadian Chamber. You can have them hold those legal licenses which protect you in the distributor agreement.
Would you find that getting IP protection or trademarking in Vietnam would be typically expensive?
It's time consuming. Oops, sorry. We've actually, so our Tractus, if you see on some of our materials, our Tractus, we've registered a couple trademarks there, and we did it ourselves. We have people on the ground. So if you're using for something like that, you can usually go with a reputable local law firm, and you're probably going to be spending maybe $5,000 for that process. But what it could take a couple of years to get it done.
Hmm.
Certainly no more than 5,000 US. Sometimes
Not
less
an
if it's a local
investment.
firm, but an investment in protecting your trademark if that's very valuable for you. Yes.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap it up with one final question, and we'll go back to the culture question. So give us the big tip, if you will, for the North American, for the Atlantic Canadian business person that's going into a meeting for the first time with a potential Vietnamese partner, supplier, buyer. What do we need to be mindful of?
There's the cultural side of it, but one of the very important things to think about always is to just be prepared, so that you can ask some Columbo questions, and or that as much as you can about that partner before you actually go into a meeting. It could be this could be a Zoom call instead of a meeting.
Sure.
But I mean, we think the kind of business etiquette, just being professional, being straightforward, and not putting somebody on the spot necessarily, and asking them questions. Face is important. Always, letting them speak. Not if they say something, you may end up meeting somebody that's boastful or trying to show that their capabilities may be more than they actually are. You probably don't want, if you've done your research, you may not want to call them out on that. Or if they don't tell you that you're representing, that they're representing particular complementary products when they are, you don't want to call them out on that directly. You want to try to do things indirectly in some cases. And or those types of things, if they're not as straightforward as you think they are, which they may not be, the direct communications is not as common as in Canada, for sure. You want to be indirect where you can, and it's also helpful to have some kind of interlocutor, some support some kind of support with somebody that speaks the local language. So yeah, obviously you'll need to be communicating, and they'll need to be fluent in English, but it's always helpful to have somebody on your side to be able to speak to them in Vietnamese as well as part of that research and relationship building. We think there needs to be a balance on both sides.
Wonderful. That's very helpful advice. So I think with that, Dennis, we'll close.
Okay.
And thank you again for your excellent presentation and most helpful advice.
You're welcome, Susan.
Folks will have your contact information. And of course, we keep all the presentations saved up on our event platform. For those of you who want to join us tomorrow and haven't registered, you can certainly do that by clicking on the session information and just popping it in your email. And again, Dennis, so thank you for spending the evening with us. And thanks to you and your team for helping us to coordinate all of the sessions this week. I personally have learned so much about these emerging markets, and I do hope that our audience feels the same way. So we'll conclude day 4 then, and hopefully you'll be able to join us again tomorrow. Dennis's colleague Uday will join us again. We just have one presentation tomorrow. Uday is going to wrap us up with a conversation about Southeast Asia generally, with a focus again on Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines, all wrapped up in one quick 1-hour period. But Dennis, I am glad that you mentioned localization, and I am going to put a plug in because we do have an ongoing website localization program here in Atlantic Canada. We worked very hard all fall to bring to Atlantic Canadian companies a series of webinars that focus on being online in several different markets around the world. And we do have a series that's going to start up again. Hang on a second, because I don't have the dates in front of me. We'll post that information on our session. I think the dates are coming up throughout February. And there are some spotlights on some of these ASEAN and Asian markets that we've talked about this week. And so with that, everybody, thank you again. Je vous souhaite une très bonne journée. Thank you and have a wonderful day.